Australia is a proud sporting nation, a country who at the very core identifies its very existence as a powerful and passionate sporting system with significant franchises, rivalries and personalities ingrained into its history as deep as the earth that is walked upon in its island home. Australia doesn't have sport take part within it like other countries. Australia is sport. And if you are an athlete who is good enough to make it to the highest levels in Australia, then your star power and attention is only comparable to that of the Prime Minister, and even they do not resonate as well as Australia's sporting heroes. But away from the glitz and glamour of the Australian sporting vernacular is the dark side, which rears its ugly head from time to time. Whether that be Adam Goodes being racially abused into retirement, the Melbourne Storm systematically cheating the salary cap, or the Bombers doping scandal, there always comes a time in Australian sport when the news breaks through the realm of sport and into mainstream media. And for all of the controversies over the years, there is one that stands above the rest, one that shook the entire country to its very core and challenged the very ethics of Australian sport. One that tainted and will continue to taint Australia's team forevermore. Sandpaper. Paper with sand or another abrasive attached to it, with the goal being to smooth and polish woodwork or other substances. Commonly used by tradies and is a feature in a variety of workplaces. And it was this piece of building equipment, no bigger than the size of a credit card, which systematically gutted the Australian cricket team. This is the complete analysis of the Australian cricket team's darkest hour, a three-part series which will look firstly at the state of Australian cricket leading up to Sandpaper Gate, followed by an analysis of what actually happened, and finally the impacts of cricket's biggest ever controversy. This is Sandpaper Gate, the documentary.
Well, he's second to Bradman. He has the hand-eye coordination and the mental toughness of Bradman, without question.
Steve Smith as Test Captain 45.
Words have been said. It's about the time to get on the cricket, and hopefully, there's a little bit of banter out there.
You premeditated the cheating.
Cheating.
Can you explain? I would ban anyone involved in it.
How can our team be engaged in cheating like this? But I have to say that the whole nation...
The Australian cricket team of the 2000s didn't do much besides win. We won literally everything. World Cups, Champions Trophies, we won in India, South Africa, Pakistan, and most importantly, we won plenty of Ashes series. Spearheaded by greats of the game such as Waugh, Ponting, Langer, Gilchrist, Warne, McGrath, Hayden, and many, many more. Winning was an absolute given for this team of superstars, but then it happened. By the Ashes in 2010-11, Ricky Ponting was the only one who had played the vast majority of matches through Australia's golden era. After losing the 2009 Ashes in England, the Aussies returned home and got absolutely destroyed by a ruthless England side under Andrew Strauss. And suddenly, Australia was no longer the big brother to their Ashes counterparts, with England now firmly the better side. From 2010 to 2013, Australia were an okay team filled with some good players. Michael Clarke had an incredible run in which he was scoring double centuries for fun, while players such as David Warner were just starting to climb the ranks. However, this team was definitely not as good as England and South Africa, who were the two dominant powers in Test cricket at the time. Australia were mediocre and far from the all-conquering team that was not long ago. Fast forward to late 2014, at which by this point in time, Australia had once again built to a position of power in Test cricket. The previous summer, Australia had beaten England 5-0 and then South Africa 2-1 and were up 1-0 against India heading to the Gabba. Michael Clarke has just been ruled out of the remainder of the series after tearing his hamstring, so Brad Haddin was expected to captain the side in his absence. However, in a bar in Adelaide sat Haddin, Mark Taylor, the man who is on the board of selecting who will captain Australia, and finally Stephen Peter Devereux Smith, a man who is very important to this story. Smith is 25 years old, and following a few years in and out of the side, he has finally cemented his place in the national team. Haddin mentioned to Mark Taylor that there was no point in him captaining the remainder of the series, and instead they should give it to Steve Smith with an eye on the future. Smith agreed he was ready. Taylor made some phone calls, and suddenly within 24 hours, Steve Smith was Australia's Test captain. A year later, he would become full-time captain following the retirement of Michael Clarke, with David Warner his deputy. Usually the Australian Test captain is a person who has been a long-term figure in the side and has likely done some work as vice-captain before carrying the role. This happened for many Aussie captains, from Taylor to Waugh to Ponting and then to Clark. But Smith did not follow in this pattern and was fast-tracked into the job, meaning he didn't have the effective time to learn from his predecessor. Thrown into it relatively freshly, Smith initially did a great job, leading Australia to Test series victories over New Zealand twice as well as the West Indies. However, after losing 3-0 to Sri Lanka, Smith was under enormous pressure, which he was dealing with for the first time in his career as captain, with little understanding on how to deal with it. The selectors had let Smith down, asking him to learn the most important job in Australian sport on the go and without effective supervision. What didn't help was that Smith didn't have much help either. Following the 2015 Ashes, Australia saw a host of the senior playing group retire, with Michael Clarke, Chris Rogers, Shane Watson and Ryan Harris all packing up for retirement. That meant that Steve Smith's new vice-captain was one of the only people he could rely on.
Is that the spot for 100 in the session, man, is it? Yeah. That's what you got to do, is it? Mate, well done. Well done on
David Warner is a very polarising figure in world cricket. One side of Warner is the boy who came from the rough ends of Sydney and made it to the top through blasting away bowling attacks in all three formats. The other is a man who on the field lives and dies by the sword, looking to intimidate his opposition at every chance and is hated by opponents. This style of cricket is not an issue, and many teams have leaders who often push the boundaries in order to one-up their opposition and throw them off their game. What was an issue was that this style was very different from the more mellow and calming demeanour of Steve Smith. And throughout this period, you could see that the more Smith and Warner operated alongside each other, there was potential that maybe as a duo it would not work out as well as they initially thought. Steve Smith is not a confrontational character. Is he fiercely competitive? Absolutely. But unlike Warner, he was traditionally not one to get into the fight with opposition players. Until he became captain, and then progressively, Smith seemed to be more willing to get into it with the opposition. There was no friction between the two players, and by all accounts they get on extremely well and continue so to this day. But their styles of leadership could not be more different, and that affected the way the team operated in this period. So let's quickly recap that. Australia are only just appearing to come out of a tough period. The team is starting to encounter its first challenges. A rocky leadership duo is leading the team. Australia is heading to Hobart to play South Africa in the second test match of the series after being beaten comfortably in Perth a week earlier. The pressure on the side is at an all-time high for these players' careers up to this point. Steve Smith in particular is in serious trouble. In just his second year of full-time captaincy, the man dubbed the best since Bradman is staring down the barrel of a fifth straight test defeat, something that is simply not allowed to happen for Australia's team. Losing the toss in Hobart against a world-class bowling attack in seaming conditions, Australia needs to bat well, but the odds are heavily stacked against them. The side is bowled out for just 85, and the team goes on to lose the test match and the series. In the sheds following the defeat, the dejected Australian team is confronted by Cricket Australia's CEO at the time, James Sullivan, and Pat Howard, the General Manager of Team Performance. Esteemed cricket writer Gideon Haigh comments on how they had the floor in their dark jackets and ties amid the cricketers and support staff in their official team gear. The Australian cricket team is not allowed to lose, and the players are about to find that out. In Steve Smith's book The Journey, he claims that the side received a dressing down from the suits, while also attempting to intimidate the players with a message about changes being made. He would later go on to say that they told the playing group that they were not being paid to play, but rather to win. This further spurred on the Australian team's win-at-all-cost mentality. David Warner's manager has even claimed that the officials told them to tamper with the ball if that was what was going to get them to win. However, that remains unconfirmed. What is confirmed is that there was enormous weight on the Australian cricket team, with the stress beginning to build up. Questions about performances of the batting order, Smith and Warner's leadership, a scathing from the Cricket Australia officials, and all of the country scrutinising this so-called crisis in Australian cricket. This test match truly triggered one of the most disturbing downward spirals in cricket history. It's nearly time for Australia's biggest series, the Ashes. Back in Australia for the first time since 2014, and it is building as a fascinating series. Australia is favoured to win the series, however it isn't inconceivable to predict an English series victory given the weaknesses of the Australian top order. If Australia was to lose this series, then the pressure gauge would once again go into overdrive. Australia dropped to the parochial left-handed wicketkeeper Matthew Wade for state teammate Tim Payne, who once a prodigy had been ruined by injury throughout the majority of his career, only to be thrown a lifeline thanks to a 50 against England in the warm-up match a few weeks prior. In would also pop Cameron Bancroft from Western Australia, 24 years old and a determined, gritty, team-orientated, tough opening batsman who was ready to solidify his place in the Australian side. England made 302 in the first innings, a decent score but slightly under par, and before long the nightmare scenario had started for Australia. Bancroft gone, then Khawaja, then Warner, and before long Steve Smith was out there with Pat Cummins up the other end, staring down the barrel of a 1-0 series defeat. Humiliation on the cards, pressure high, Australian team on his shoulders, but this isn't any ordinary batsman. Steve Smith put the team on his back, plundering 141 not out off a marathon 326 balls, mentally destroying England before the series had even started. They just couldn't get him out. England collapsed in the second innings, leaving the young and hungry opening batsman to hit the winning runs. Australia wouldn't look back from there, winning the Test series before even getting to Melbourne. Australia had broken England thanks to one man, and the Australian cricket team rejoiced in the love for their team.
West Australian squad, it's been measured. There's an actual measurement for it, so just took the blow quite well and then moved on from it. Yeah, it was a good hit. Play on.
After regaining the Ashes, you can tell by Steve Smith's comments about how he was feeling mentally. It's obviously huge pressure. No matter what series you play here in Australia, you're always expected to win. That's what we expect of ourselves as well, you know? Jeff Lemon recounts in his book Steve Smith's Men that for Smith winning the Ashes was filled with relief rather than elation, like the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Australia had won the series 4-0 in crushing circumstances. England left Australia with no shortage of cuts and wounds of a series in which the verbal volleys on and off the field stretched far and wide. David Warner had called Test cricket a war pre-series, and it's fair to say that Australia played as if they were in the trenches, which rubbed off against some the wrong way. But if you're on a winning side, it can often paint over cracks in culture. There was no rest for the Australians following the Ashes victory, however, because before long they were on a plane to one of the most challenging assignments in world cricket. When playing in a place as hostile as South Africa, there is always more than one villain. Like video game campaigns in which you can't win until you take care of the lot, there are a number of factors that play a role in a tour of Africa's southernmost nation. Of course, the team is filled with players underrated on the world stage, but bitterly tough. Legendary tales like Graham Smith playing on with a broken hand, or Dale Steyn ripping apart Australia on Boxing Day. South Africa in 2018 was arguably the best batting lineup in the world. AB de Villiers, Du Plessis, Amla, de Kock were all world-class players. The bowling attack was also stacked with talent. Rabada was the leader of the attack, young, feisty, aggressive, with no room to back down from any scenario. Morkel, with his tall, sharp bounce and intimidating bowling, is a distinct difference from his calm demeanour. Vernon Philander, the opposite, his chirpy and chip-on-the-shoulder personality vastly different to his economical and accurate bowling style. Despite the class of the group, the players were just one piece of the puzzle. Number 2 is the media, in particular Supersport, South Africa's chief cricket broadcaster. Known for its close connection with Cricket South Africa, as well as questionable broadcasting decisions, such as splicing footage of players with binoculars to attractive women in the crowd. And finally, the South African cricket supporters are the chief villains in South Africa. Similar to Australian fans in that their unrelenting support for their national side can often spill over to controversy and abuse, with no one safe from their wrath. Despite all this going into the series, Australia was seen as a tough test for South Africa that had not been seen on their shores since England toured 2 years prior. And after the first few days of the Test match, Australia were well on top. Australia and South Africa don't like each other. The crop of players from this era had run-ins in the previous Test series, and with the war of words starting heading into the series, it was clear that this edition would be no different. It's day 4 of the Test match, and South Africa are a long way behind the game. However, one man at the crease is the key if the Proteas are to make a comeback into the match. AB de Villiers, 22 Test centuries, 360-degree, superstar all-format player who finished on 71 not out in the first innings. Australia don't know how to get him out. If they can't get him out, he could do what he and Graham Smith architected in 2008 when the South Africans chased down 414 at the Wacker. He's good enough to do it again. Luckily for the Australians, Markram pushes one into the leg side and barbecues the senior batsman. AB is gone, and so is the likelihood of South African victory. The Aussies erupt into celebration. Lyon drops the ball onto De Villiers, while Warner roars in anger and aggression, with the target not being AB, but the young man who runs him out. The first domino of this disastrous series had fallen. Now, Quinton de Kock is an interesting cricketer who has had his fair share of controversy over the years. However, after seeing what had occurred on the field and staring down the barrel of a defeat, he decided to take things away from the bat and instead decided to play a few shots out of his mouth instead, hurling some personal attacks at David Warner. Here is what Tim Payne said about the incident in his book. Davey was chirpy and he was particularly keen to talk to Quinton de Kock. He was into him every ball about being overweight, unprofessional, having a big off-season on the food. It was essentially harmless, but he was relentless. Davey was at him on the way off for lunch on day 4. I was nearby and heard the whole conversation. David was upset because he thought he heard de Kock make comments about his wife, Candace, but then the South African team came up with a story that David had started it by making a comment about de Kock's sister. I was there. I was the one holding them apart, and I know how it unfolded. In my view, David had every right to be upset. The verbal volleys continued all the way up into the change rooms, with both sides engaging with each other until Tim Payne and an almost nude Faf du Plessis seemingly calmed the situation down. The footage you're watching here got leaked, and suddenly Australia was once again in the news. Pressure was building, and again another domino had fallen. Australia went on to win the first test, but South Africa would fight back hard in the second match to tie the series. Tempers would flare again when Rabada bumped Steve Smith after removing the star batsman, with the match officials citing him, meaning he would miss the rest of the series. Pressure began to build off the field as well. Vernon Philander wrote an interesting tweet before claiming he was hacked, and CSA officials were posing with people who had Sonny Bill Williams masks. I'm not going to explain the despicable reason behind the masks, that's for you to Google. All you need to know is that David Warner and Steve Smith have a lot on their minds going to Cape Town. For David Warner, he has no answers for Rabada and is struggling to find runs, is being harassed by South African players, is still the chief bull to do the sledging for the Australians. All the while, the Supersport coverage, as well as the fans of the Proteas, are piling on the pain from the stands. Steve Smith, on the other hand, is captaining a side whose bowling attack tactically has no answers for the South African top order, struggling to carry the side with the bat as he has done in the past, and is having trouble keeping his playing group from being sucked into the drama that was embroiling the series. And if all of that isn't enough, the South African team challenged the ruling on Kagiso Rabada, which meant he was free to play the remaining tests of the series. It started to feel like the weight of 3 years of constant pressure, expectation, and the controversial imagery of the Australian team was weighing down on them. Something major felt like it was just around the corner. With all that in the back of their minds, it was time to head to Cape Town, where everything exploded and Australian cricket came crashing down.